Hello Flight Simmers and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. This is Ground Lesson 1 in our instrument training series. In this lesson we'll take a look at navigating en route under instrument flight rules. Navigating en route under IFR is not much different than navigating en route under VFR using electronic navigation systems. If you understand how to use systems like VORs, DME, GPS, and NDBs, then you already know most of what you need to know to navigate IFR en route. If you don't know how to navigate using these systems or you'd like a refresher, I'll leave a link to my videos on these topics in this video's description. So we'll spend most of this lesson learning how to read IFR en route charts. IFR navigation requires knowing your position with a little more precision than VFR navigation. One of my first instructors liked to say that VFR rewards good navigation, but IFR demands it. So IFR charts give you more information that helps you determine your exact position than do VFR charts. Altitudes are also more important when flying IFR since you may not be able to see the ground or obstacles along your route. So IFR charts contain a lot of information that helps you determine a safe altitude for en route flying when you can't see anything. There are a lot of similarities between IFR charts and VFR charts, so if you're unfamiliar with VFR charts, make sure to check out the video on using VFR charts on this channel. I'll leave a link to that video in this video's description. There are two different entities that publish IFR charts for the United States, the Federal Aviation Administration and Jeppesen. Jeppesen charts, or JEPs, are commercial charts, so you have to order and pay for these charts through Jeppesen or some other provider, and the charts are copyrighted, so I won't be covering these charts in this video, though most of the data is similar and not too hard to figure out if you know how to read government charts. Digital versions of the FAA charts are freely available to the public, and all the charts we'll be looking at today, and indeed all IFR charts and approach plates for the U.S. and its territories, are available for free at Skyvector.com. There are two main types of FAA IFR en route charts. Low altitude, which covers the airspace between the surface up to but not including 18,000 feet, and high altitude charts, which cover the airspace at 18,000 feet and above. There are also IFR area charts, which are low altitude charts for large terminal areas, similar to the VFR terminal area charts. I tend not to use them very much as I can get most of the data that I would get from them from a low chart or an approach plate, but they do contain airport data for airports in large congested terminal areas, which regular en route charts don't. The FAA publishes low altitude charts for the entire contiguous United States, Alaska, Hawaii, and the Pacific U.S. territories and the Caribbean. In addition, Skyvector contains low and high altitude IFR en route coverage for most areas of the world, and unlike the VFR charts, you'll find a similar level of detail and coverage for IFR charts in most of the world as you do in the U.S. Low charts for the contiguous U.S. are designated with L and a number. There are a total of 35 charts used to cover the contiguous U.S. The charts are different sizes, so their scale varies, but most charts cover a larger area than sectionals and use a smaller scale. The chart depiction shows the area of coverage for each chart and depicts the locations of the largest U.S. cities relative to the chart coverage. Cities depicted in black are locations where an IFR area chart is available. There are a total of 12 high charts that cover the contiguous U.S., so the scale is much smaller on these charts, but that works well for the aircraft that use this airspace, as they usually travel on the faster side. So a little refresher, if you are new to using Skyvector or you haven't used it in a while, the website's easy to get to. It is just skyvector.com, capital S-K-Y, capital V-E-C-T-O-R.com will get you to the site. It should default to the World VFR map view, and all of the map views that are available are displayed up here in the right-hand side of the screen, and it will change as we move the chart around and have different charts available to us. Of course, we've got the World VFR, which we've talked about before in section VFR charts and sectionals. The ones we're interested in for IFR is the World Low, which brings you a composite IFR chart, basically all the charts smashed together, basically for the entire world. So this is where you want to go to get a low en route chart. And then the World High will give you a composite or smashed together chart, IFR high en route chart, again, basically for the entire world. If we want to look at specific charts, then we can click on some of the other options. For example, en route H6 gives us the high en route H6 chart, and we can zoom back and see all of the chart there. And there is some information on the side panels, such as we have restricted areas, prohibited areas if there are any, and alert areas over here. It tells you when those are, the altitudes those are at, and the times those are in use in the real world, and then who the controlling agency is. So that would be why you'd want to break out and look at individual charts. You also have the load charts available here. And you can see each chart has two sides to it. You have L15 is to the left here, L16 is to the right, and each chart has different information. In the real life, you have L15 on the front side of this piece of paper and L16 on the back side. One side of the chart is going to have the legend, so if you want to go and look at the legend and reference anything in there, you want to pick the chart that's typically on the left, I believe. If you actually look at the chart coverage map over here, you can see L15, L16. L15 is the one that has the legend on it. It's the one that we are looking at right now. And so you can scroll over here and look at this coverage area over here. And then if you want to look at the other side of the chart, it does contain different information. We'll go over here and look at L16. You can see on the left side of this panel, it has all the military training route information that's on this particular chart, on both charts, L15 and L16. It has a special use airspace that is in the low altitude sector. Again, it tells you the area, and it tells you the altitude, times it's in use in the real world, the controlling agency. And then it also has the military operations area with the same information for that. The other thing it has on this side is it has every airport that's on this chart, and then it lists the panel that it's on. You can see it has alphabet designators at the top of the chart here, and each kind of section of the chart has a designation. So this is panel F, panel G, panel H, and then this will tell you over here if you're looking for a specific airport, which panel that's on. Not something you really need necessarily in the age of digital charts. You can just go up here to your search function and find an airport that way, or a navigate or an intersection, but that was handy back in the day of paper charts. And again, as we move around the country, you can see that what's available to us in terms of chart coverage changes. If we go down here to the Dallas area, not only do we have the World High and the World Low and the World VFR and the individual sectional charts and en route charts, we also have the DFW area chart available to us now. We also have the terminal area chart available to us now. We have the VFR fly routes available to us, and we have the Dallas helicopter chart available to us now too. So if you're looking for a particular, especially a terminal type area chart or IFR area chart, just scroll over the city that you're looking for that chart at, and then it should bring up that option to view that chart up in the top right-hand corner over here. The last thing that I'll mention about Skyvector is that it does have approach plates and terminal procedures for all of the U.S. coverage area. It does not have those for outside the United States, but all you have to do if you want to pull up a chart or any sort of terminal procedure for a given airport is right-click on that airport and then hover over the airport name, and that will bring you up all of the instrument approaches and or terminal procedures that are available for that airport, and then just select on the approach procedure you want to view, and that will bring up that approach procedure. We'll scroll over here to Memphis, which has a few more terminal procedures. Again, right-click, hover over, and you can see now not only do we get approach procedures, but we get the airport diagram, we get the instrument departures or SIDs, and we get the standard terminal arrival routes or the stars as well, so we can view any of those that we want to view. So let's look in detail at a low en route chart first. The first thing that you'll notice about IFR charts when you compare them to VFR charts is that most of the surface features have been removed and replaced with a plain white background. Since you'll theoretically be in the clouds and unable to see any ground features to navigate by, removing them allows for a cleaner map with a smaller scale and more room for information pertinent to instrument navigation. You'll notice that the only ground feature to remain are large bodies of water, such as large lakes and oceans. There are two reasons for this. First, so you have an awareness of when you're over a large body of water, since you might need to carry additional equipment if you're beyond power-off gliding distance to shore in the real world. And the second reason is a holdover from older navigation systems like NDBs, whose performance and range could be affected by features like large bodies of water. You'll also notice that while we still have a lat-long grid system on IFR charts, the grid on low charts is done in degrees rather than half degrees, making the grid squares 4 times larger on these charts. The lines of longitude and latitude are blue on these charts, and the small tick marks indicate 10 minutes of longitude and latitude, with the larger ones in the middle marking 30 minutes. We also still have isogonic lines for magnetic variation on the charts marked as solid green lines with the magnetic variation beside them, as well as time zone boundaries which are marked with dotted green lines. Most of the symbols for Navaids are very similar to what you see on VFR charts, with symbols for VORs, VOR DMEs, TACANs, which again we can't use in civilian aircraft, Vortax, NDBs, and the rarer finds like standalone DME stations and NDB DMEs. If the station is filled in black, that means it's a compulsory reporting point, which means you need to report passing over the station to ATC in the real world. You typically see this type of station in an area where there is poor or no radar coverage. The Navaid data box is very similar to what you find on a VFR chart, though there are a few things that are added. The box gives you the name of the station, whether the station is a high or low altitude VOR, which tells you something about its range, the frequency, the 3-letter identifier for the station, the TACAN channel, which again we can't use as civilians, but it does let us know that the station has DME, the Morse code for the 3-letter identifier for the station, and the lat-long for the station. It also gives us frequencies for contacting flight service stations on top and what the name of the flight service station is on the bottom. But as we mentioned before, flight service is not something that's emulated in Flight Simulator. The NDB data box gives us all the information we need to know about NDBs, and it's the same as what we find on VFR charts, including station name, the frequency for the station, the 2 or 3-letter identifier, depending on the type of station it is, and the Morse code for the 2 or 3-letter identifier. The airport symbols on IFR charts are different depending on what type of airport it is. For a civilian airport, it's a circle with the 4 tick marks. For a combined civil-military airport, it is 2 circles with the tick marks. For a military-only field, it is just the 2 circles without the tick marks. A heliport is just a circle with an H in the middle, and then a seaport is a circle with tick marks and an anchor in the center. Airports are color-coded according to what kind of instrument approaches they have. If you have a blue airport, you know that it has a high instrument approach. This is more for military users. This means that it has a high altitude instrument approach that typically things like fighter aircraft will utilize. You can see this one here at Fort Smith. Starts off over the VOR at 16,000 feet and descends kind of rapidly onto the ILS, so it's kind of a tactical type approach. Typically an airport that is in blue will also have normal instrument approaches, low altitude approaches for everybody else as well. If you have a green airport, that means that it just has an instrument approach, but it doesn't have one of those high type instrument approaches. And then a brown airport means that that airport does not have an instrument approach. It also means that that airport has not been evaluated for any sort of departure procedure. So basically the rule of thumb on IFR charts is if it's blue or green for civilian users, you know it has an instrument approach you can probably use. If it's brown, it does not have an instrument approach. Somewhere nearby the airport symbol, you'll have a data block that will give you information about the airport. This is available in low charts. It is available in high charts, but it doesn't have quite as much information. So with this data block here, we know that we are looking at Texarkana Regional Web Field. We know that the three-letter identifier is TXK. To the right of that tells us about the airspace. If it's D or C airspace, it will tell us over to the right of the identifier. And then the little star that means that in the real world, this tower is part-time, so it's not always Class D airspace. But this is an emulated flight simulator. The towers are 24/7 in Flight Simulator. It tells us that the elevation of the field is 390 feet above sea level. It tells us that the runways, or at least one runway, is lighted, and then the little circle means that in the real world it's pilot-controlled lighting, but again, that's not emulated in Flight Simulator. All the runway lighting is on 24/7 there. And then this tells us the length of the longest runway in hundreds of feet, so this is 6,600 feet long. So you multiply that basically by 100. Then it tells us that we have weather information available on this frequency. This particular station is an automated surface observation system. If you tune into 120.2, you'll be able to get that. It also has, anytime you see an A in parentheses, that means it's an ATIS frequency, and you'll notice they're on the same frequency. So in real life, what probably happens is the ATIS is available when the tower is open, and then when the tower closes down, you can get the ASOS on that frequency instead. And again, in Flight Simulator, the tower is not going to close, so the ATIS should be available all the time in Flight Simulator. At the top, you'll notice it has a little identifier that says MON. What this means is that this airport is part of the minimum operational network. This is a network of airports that have at least one VOR, ILS, or localizer approach that can be used in the event that there is a GPS outage. So basically, they're keeping some of the older Navaids and older approaches active just in case there is a GPS outage. And it means that it should allow for navigation on an instrument approach procedure without the use of DME, ADF, GPS, or radar. So basically, if the GPS system goes down, radar is not available at this airport, it should allow you to shoot an approach as long as you have at least one VOR receiver with a glide slope. You should be able to shoot an approach and get in instrument conditions at this field. As far as airspace depiction goes on the low IFR charts, anytime you see a blue shaded area like this that has a dashed line around it, that is Class C airspace. And you can see South Bend over here lists itself as Class C in the airport data block. And then if you have the same sort of shaded area, usually larger, but the line is not dashed, that is the outer limits of the Class B airspace surrounding the larger airports. You notice it doesn't go into as much detail as far as the layers and altitudes of that airspace. It's not quite as important when you're flying IFR, when you get an IFR clearance or file an IFR flight plan into Bravo airspace by virtue of you being cleared as filed or whatever route you're cleared on. That automatically clears you into Bravo airspace, and you do not have to get a separate clearance to get into Bravo airspace. You'll also know that it depicts the 30 nautical mile mode C and ADS-B out ring. It's just a thin blue line, and it is not shaded in the airspace that is where you need the mode C and the ADS-B out, but you don't need, you're not necessarily in Class Bravo yet. The special use airspace is depicted in a very similar manner to how it's depicted on VFR charts. The military operations areas, instead of being red, are kind of this brown color, but it's the same sort of hatch symbol to show you the outlines of the airspace. Again, if you want specifics on what altitude the airspace is located at, you have to go into the side panel on one of the charts, and then restricted areas, prohibit areas, and alert areas, and warning areas are all still depicted in blue. And again, in order to get the altitudes for that airspace, you'll have to go to the side panels of the charts. Another airspace boundary that's depicted on the charts is this little blue zipper line right here. This is the boundary between air traffic control centers. So to the north of this boundary is Kansas City Center, and to the south of this boundary is Memphis Center. And it also gives us a thing here. It says CPDLC. This is to let folks know that this particular center can do a data link. This stands for Controller Pilot Data Link Communications. So you can communicate via a data link with this center as well. It also gives little kind of postage stamp looking things in the middle of the charts that gives you the frequencies, both the VHF and the UHF frequencies, which are for military users, to contact if you're in a certain area of the country to communicate with that center. So this stamp tells you that this is Kansas City. The transmitter for this particular station is located in Maples, and then it gives you the frequencies you can get in. You can see we've got a transmitter over here. Same thing as Kansas City, but this transmitter is located in Farmington. A lot of information on IFR charts has to do with airways. So what are airways? Airways are designated routes on which aircraft can navigate, which aids in aircraft separation. Airways have a designated width. They are generally extend 4 nautical miles from the center line on either side of the airway, so they're a total of 8 nautical miles wide. And there are minimum altitudes specified on each airway or segment of an airway for IFR pilots to keep them clear of obstacles and ensure they can receive any navigation and communication signals they need to operate IFR. There are 2 primary types of low-altitude airways in the U.S. VOR airways or Victor airways that are depicted in black on low IFR charts and for the most part route between VOR stations. Tango airways are GPS-based airways. These are depicted in blue and typically route between GPS waypoints. There are some other airway types that you'll run into on low charts, such as the low-altitude Atlantic routes off the U.S. East Coast and the Bahama routes that extend from Florida into the Bahamas. There are also low-frequency routes, which are found primarily in Alaska and use NDB bearings to define their routes. Occasionally, you'll see airways with little gray squiggly symbols through them. These are airways that used to exist but have been decommissioned and are no longer in operation. The symbology on all low-altitude airways is the same for the most part, and the general rule is that an airway on which you can use ground-based navaids to navigate will be depicted in black, and an airway that you need to use GPS to navigate on will be depicted in blue. So let's take a closer look at Victor Airways. Again, Victor Airways generally run between 2 VORs. Just like on VFR charts, the radials you need to track to fly the airway will be depicted just outside the VOR compass rose symbol. The airway designator or route number is listed in a black box, usually towards the middle of the airway. The total distance between the 2 VORs that define that segment of the airway is listed under the airway number, outlined in a thin black box. Most airways are divided into smaller segments to help an IFR pilot more precisely determine their position. These segments are identified by fixes, also sometimes called intersections or reporting points, which are depicted with small, hollow, black triangle symbols. The distance between each fix on the airway is noted below that airway segment with black numbers that don't have anything else around them, like a box. For example, if we're traveling on Victor 140 between Harrison VOR and Walnut Ridge VOR here, the first segment here between Harrison VOR and Caden is 10 nautical miles long. And the next segment between Caden and Berg is 1 nautical mile long. They didn't have enough room to put it down below the airway in this case, so they moved it up above the airway. The next segment of the airway that goes between Berg and Pyatt intersection is 13 nautical miles long. So each of these numbers that are, for the most part, below the airway without any boxes or anything around them are the mileage of that particular segment of the airway. Any fix on a chart depicted with a small triangle can be identified using ground-based navigation equipment such as VORs, DME, localizers, or localizer back courses. While fixes are usually found on airways, some fixes are not located on airways. For example, if we take a look at the low en route chart over by Little Rock, Pine Bluff, Memphis area, we'll notice to the southwest of Helena, to the southwest of the Marvel VOR, we have a fix that's not on an airway over here, the Barf intersection. We also have another fix to the southeast of the Pine Bluff area fay that is not located on an airway. Fixes can also be located on approaches as well. There are a number of ways to identify fixes. You can identify them by the intersection of two VOR radials. You can identify them by a DME distance on one specific VOR radial. You can identify them by the intersection of one VOR radial and a localizer front course or back course. And you could identify them with DME distance on a localizer front course or back course. So let's take a look at a chart and talk about the different ways we can identify a fix. So we said we can identify a fix as an intersection of two VOR radials. An example of this would be Bunn's intersection. We can identify that as the intersection of the 244 degree radial off of Pine Bluff and the 193 degree radial off of Little Rock VOR. When those two radials intersect, we know that we are at Bunn's intersection. We can also identify it with cross radials that aren't necessarily on a Victor Airway. For example, we can identify Taft intersection with the intersection or Taft fix as the intersection of the 059 degree radial, which makes up Victor 124, and the 011 degree radial off of Pine Bluff, which is not a navigable route. The only time these thin VOR radials would be depicted on the chart is when they're used to identify an intersection or something like that. You can also see we can do that with something like Barf intersection. It's at the intersection of the 228 degree radial from Helena or the 360 degree radial coming up from Greenville VOR, which is slightly off where I have this chart centered here. And we can also identify it at the intersection of the 328 radial coming from Sidon VOR SQS down to the south, and that's far enough away or even off the chart that they put a little flag up here to tell us where this radial is coming from. So the intersection of any of those radials will tell us that we are at Barf intersection. We also said that we could identify intersections using DME. So another way to identify Bunn's intersection over here would be if we are on the 244 degree radial from Pine Bluff and we're at 26 DME, we know we're at Bunn's intersection. They use this little hollow arrow symbol with a kind of a D symbol with the DME distance inside that kind of D-shaped box there. And we can also tell that we are, if we're on the 193 degree radial and at 38 nautical miles or 38 DME from Little Rock, that is also identifying the Bunn's intersection as well. You can also identify an intersection or a fix if it is the same mileage as the first segment from a VOR. They'll use the same little hollow arrow symbol here, but without the D box, since the distance is the same as the segment length. So this segment length from Pine Bluff VOR to Ioun is 8 nautical miles. So we can use 8 DME on the 244 degree radial from Pine Bluff to identify Ioun intersection. Again, we can also do this with off-airway fixes. It will tell us, for instance, that we can identify the Barf intersection as the 228 degree radial at 15 DME from Marvel VOR, or the 65 DME on the 328 radial from Sidon VOR, or the 53 DME fix on the 360 degree radial from Greenville VOR. And as we said earlier, we can also identify a fix as an intersection of a VOR radial and a localizer course. And the only time you will see localizer courses depicted on a lower en route chart is when they serve a navigational function for that en route chart, if they serve to identify something like a fix. And we can see this depicted up here at Little Rock. It tells us that we can identify the Dumpy intersection up here as the intersection of the 030 degree radial and off of Little Rock, and the localizer front course for this localizer here in Little Rock. So 110.3 AAY, I believe that's the localizer front course for Tutti Right in Little Rock. If we're at the intersection of that localizer and that radial, we know we're at Dumpy intersection. You'll see it also has a DME symbol up here, so it can also identify Dumpy as being on the localizer front course at 19 DME, and we can also identify it as 19 DME from the 030 degree radial. Each fix is identified with a 5-letter identifier that can be used to communicate your position with ATC, and these identifiers can also be entered into a GPS if you want to navigate directly to them or use them as part of a route. Occasionally, you'll see these fixes depicted as solid triangles instead of hollow ones. This turns them into compulsory reporting points in the real world, which means you need to tell air traffic control when you pass over these fixes. In the real world, these are typically located in areas without radar coverage, such as offshore. You'll also see filled-in symbols for things like Navaid, which again turn these into compulsory reporting points. And again, these are usually located in areas without radar coverage in the real world. On most Victor Airways, you should change which VOR you're using for navigation at the halfway point of the airway. For example, if I'm navigating from Pine Bluff VOR down to Greenville VOR on Victor 74, the total length of the airway between those two VORs is 64. Half of that is 32. So when I get 32 nautical miles away from Pine Bluff VOR, I should stop navigating off of the 128 radial outbound from Pine Bluff and switch over and navigate on the 309 degree radial inbound to Greenville. But on some airways, the changeover will not be halfway, and it will be marked with what we call a changeover point symbol. So if we assume that we're navigating from Pine Bluff VOR on Victor 16 down towards Texarkana VOR, we can see as we get halfway through that route, we have this changeover symbol here, which is a line going across the airway and then two lines going parallel, one pointing to one VOR and the other pointing to the other VOR. And then it gives us a mileage on top of this here. So it tells us that when we are 54 nautical miles away from Pine Bluff, we need to stop navigating off of the Pine Bluff VOR and switch over to the Texarkana VOR. Likewise, if we're headed up from Texarkana towards Pine Bluff, we have a DME fixed to identify this intersection here. So when we get 62 nautical miles away from the Texarkana VOR, that's where we need to swap over to the Pine Bluff VOR and start navigating inbound to the Pine Bluff VOR. You can see we also have a symbol here for Victor 71. So if we're navigating from El Dorado up towards Hot Springs, when we get to 49 nautical miles away from El Dorado, we need to switch over to Hot Springs. If we're going the opposite direction, navigating from Hot Springs down to El Dorado, when we get to 26 nautical miles away from Hot Springs, we need to switch over and start navigating off of El Dorado VOR. Symbology is similar on Tango Airways or GPS Airways, but there are some differences. The points on a Tango Airway are called waypoints and are identified with a blue star symbol. Like traditional fixes, they can also be located off airways, and like traditional fixes, they can be filled in to indicate they are compulsory reporting points. They also have 5-letter identifiers that can be used with ATC or entered into a GPS. There's no boxed total mileage listed for a Tango Airway since they don't typically travel from VOR to VOR, but like Victor Airways, the distance for each segment is located under that segment. The chart also gives the magnetic course for each segment of the airway. You'll sometimes see airways that are combined Victor and Tango Airways. These airways use the symbology for both types of routes. Now let's talk about altitudes. On many Victor Airways, you'll see a 4 or 5-digit number above the airway designation. This is the minimum en route altitude, or MEA. The MEA is defined as the lowest published altitude on an airway or airway segment that meets IFR obstacle clearance requirements, ensures navigation signal coverage on that route, and ensures adequate communication signal coverage in the real world. Occasionally, you'll find an altitude below the MEA on a route that's marked with an asterisk. This is the minimum obstacle clearance altitude, or MOCA. The MOCA will meet IFR clearance requirements, but will only guarantee navigation reception on that route if you're within 22 nautical miles of the VOR station. On GPS Airways, you'll notice the MEA has a G at the end of it. And you'll see this occasionally on VOR or Victor Airways as well. This is the RNAV or GPS MEA. This altitude meets IFR obstacle clearance requirements and in the real world also ensures that you'll get adequate communication coverage along that route. You should only use this altitude on a Victor airway if you're using GPS instead of VORs to navigate on that airway. Sometimes the MEA and or MoCA on an airway will change. When this happens, there will be a perpendicular bar symbol on each side of the fix or waypoint where the change happens, and the altitudes that change will be listed on each side of the fix. When a minimum altitude changes to a higher altitude on a route, it's not necessary to start the climb to the higher altitude until you arrive at the fix where it changes in most cases. For example, let's say we're traveling from Pine Bluff up to Little Rock on Victor 74. You'll notice that the MEA for the entire route is 2,500 feet, and there's no bar symbols around the fixes on this portion of the airway. But if we continue to take Victor 74 from Little Rock northwest towards Fort Smith, you'll notice that the MEA on this first segment is 3,500 feet, and then we have a bar on either side of Mame intersection here. And then if we look at the MEA for the next segment, it's gone up to 4,500 feet, and we now have a MoCA of 2,700 feet. So assuming you were using VORs to fly this route, we need to change to the at least the 4,500 foot MEA if we're lower than that on this first segment. But in this case, we don't need to start the climb until we reach Mame intersection, and then we can start the climb to at or above 4,500 feet for this particular segment of the route. In some cases, you'll need to cross the fix where the minimum altitude changes at or above a certain altitude. This is called a minimum crossing altitude and will be depicted with a little flag sticking out of the fix with an X in it. For example, if we are traveling westbound on Victor 532 from Little Rock to Fort Smith, you'll notice on the second segment here we have an MEA of 3,700 feet, and on the third segment we have an MEA of 5,500 feet. Ordinarily, we would not need to start the climb from 3,700 feet to 5,500 feet until we get to Gatsby intersection, but we have this little flag symbol sticking out of the fix with an X on it, which means we have a minimum crossing altitude. And then right beside the flag, it gives us the information. It tells us at Gatsby intersection if we're on Victor 532. So this does not apply if we're flying north on Victor 71, only to Victor 532, since that fix is on both airways. It tells us that we need to be at 4,800 feet. That is our minimum crossing altitude if we're traveling westbound, which is what the W there means. So instead of waiting until we get to Gatsby to start our climb for 3,700 feet, we need to start the climb early enough that we cross Gatsby at or above 4,800 feet. Sometimes, in order to receive all of the ground-based Navaids that identify a traditional fix, you'll need to be at or above a certain altitude at that fix. This is called a minimum reception altitude and is depicted with a little flag sticking out of the fix with an R in it. For example, if we're traveling again on the first segment of Victor 532 from Little Rock over towards Fort Smith, we can see that this first segment has an MEA of 2,600 feet. It does have an MEA change indicated by these two lines over here to 3,700 feet, and then has a MoCA of 3,100 feet. But there's a little flag with an R sticking out of it on this first fix on the airway, or excuse me, that's the second fix on the airway, Perrin, and it tells us to receive all of the Navaids that we need to identify that fix. Our minimum reception altitude is 3,500 feet. So in order to receive all the Navaids that will enable us to identify this fix, we need to be at or above 3,500 feet at Perrin intersection. I suspect this is to be able to receive the 051 degree radial that you can use as a cross radial to identify this fix with the 273 degree radial from Little Rock. I think you could probably receive the DME that identifies the fix at 2,600 feet. And again, you wouldn't need to start the climb to that higher MEA until you actually hit Perrin intersection. But again, it doesn't tell you which Navaid that you need to be at that altitude to receive. You just need to be at that altitude to be able to receive all the Navaids that can help you identify that fix. On some airways or airway segments, the MEA or MoCA may be different depending on the direction you're traveling on that airway. In this case, both altitudes will be listed with an arrow indicating which direction each applies to. For example, if we are traveling on Victor 74 from Fort Smith heading down to Little Rock, we can see above this first segment here that we have an MEA of 4,500 feet if we're traveling to the southeast towards Little Rock. But if we're coming the opposite direction on this particular segment up to the northwest, the MEA on that segment is 4,000 feet. There's another example here on Victor 534. If we're headed eastbound towards Little Rock, we need to be in an MEA of 4,500 feet. If we're headed northwestbound or westbound towards Fort Smith, we need to be in an MEA of 3,500 feet on this segment. And then we also have a MOCA there of 3,000 feet. For the most part, low altitude airways extend up to but don't include 18,000 feet. It's fairly rare, but occasionally you'll find a route where the maximum altitude is lower than this. This will be indicated with a maximum authorized altitude, or MAA, on that airway. For example, on Tango 204, we have an MAA of 15,000 feet on this airway. So if you're traveling on this route, the highest you can fly on this route is going to be 15,000 feet. Of course, with GPS, you don't have to fly on Airways. It's perfectly acceptable to fly direct, or you can fly directly from VOR to VOR if you're not GPS equipped. When you do that, you want to take a look at these brown numbers that are in every lat-long grid on the chart. These altitudes are the off-route obstruction clearance altitude, or OROCA, though Jeppesen calls these the grid MORA, or minimum off-route altitude. These altitudes will give you your minimum IFR obstacle clearance requirements, but won't guarantee you any kind of signal coverage in that area. So as an example, if I'm traveling between Branson Airport in Missouri here to Cumming Airport on a GPS direct route, what I want to look at is I want to take a look at all of the OROCAs in the grids that I'm going to be passing through. So in this grid over here, I'll be 3,800 feet for my OROCA. If the next grid is at 3,500 feet, and the next grid is at 3,100 feet, and the final one I pass through is going to be 2,600 feet. So I want to pick an altitude that's at or above the highest of those. So 3,800 feet, I need to pick up an altitude that's at or above 3,800 feet. Although you could probably argue that I won't be able to get at or above 3,800 feet by the time I get to the edge of that grid. So you could probably just pick an altitude that's at or above 3,500 feet and be above your off-route obstruction clearance altitude for a GPS direct route. I'll also mention that, generally speaking, you want to adhere to appropriate IFR cruising altitudes when you fly, which means odd 1,000 feet when flying eastbound and even 1,000 feet when flying westbound. So you won't typically be flying at the minimum IFR altitude for your route of flight. But you could descend to those altitudes if you needed to, if you encountered something like icing and needed to try to descend to a lower altitude. So for an example, if you are flying the GPS direct route from Branson over to Cumming, again, 3,800 is our highest OROCA, so we want to be at or above that altitude. So the lowest IFR cruising altitude that's going to be available to us going eastbound is going to be 5,000 feet along this route. But if we were to get into this grid here and we start encountering icing at 5,000 feet and we want to try to get underneath it, we could request a descent clearance to as low as 3,500 feet to see if we can get below the freezing level. If I know that icing is forecast along that route, if I know the freezing level is going to be at or above about 4,000 to 5,000 feet, a better option for me might be to go Branson direct to Harrison, VOR, then take Victor 140 over to Walnut Ridge, and then go from Walnut Ridge direct to Cumming Airport. And that opens up lower altitudes to me. Once I get on the airway, 3,000 feet becomes a viable cruising altitude since the MEA on this airway is 3,000 feet. And then once I get to Walnut Ridge, I'm now in the sector where the OROCA is 2,600 feet. So once I start that direct portion of the flight over to Cumming Municipal Airport, again, 3,000 feet is a viable altitude. But again, I could go as low as 2,600 feet if I were to start encountering icing at 3,000 feet. And one last thing I want to mention is these brown lines that you'll see going all over the chart. These are military training routes. They're only there for awareness in the real world that when you cross these, you may encounter uh, relatively heavy military traffic, but in IFR, ATC is responsible for separating all IFR traffic, so it's not something you should have to worry, that you're going to have to see and avoid, especially if you're in instrument conditions. It's just to give you an awareness that there may be military traffic when you cross these points. So let's take a look at high en route charts. As we mentioned earlier, high en route charts depict the airspace and routes at 18,000 feet and above, but the symbology is much the same as it is for low charts. The symbols for airports, Navaids, airways, and airspace is pretty much the same as it is on low charts. There are a few minor differences to be aware of. The airport data blocks contain less information than do the low charts. Any airspace that doesn't extend above 18,000 feet is not depicted on high charts. So this includes things like Class C airspace, Class B airspace, and any special use airspace that doesn't go above 18,000 feet. The VOR airways in high altitude airspace are referred to as jet routes, or they're designated with a J and a number, and the GPS routes on high altitude charts are referred to as Q routes. All airways on high charts are assumed to have an MEA of 18,000 feet. So MEAs will not be depicted unless they're higher than that. If an MEA lists a D after it, that means the MEA is only applicable to aircraft with older navigation equipment like VOR DME, IRUs, or a DME-based FMS like our beloved MD-80 had, instead of a GPS or GNSS-based system. Another unique feature of the high charts is that you will find one-direction airways in some parts of the country. These can exist as both Q routes and jet routes. These work exactly like you would expect them to. You should only file or fly on these airways if you're flying them in the appropriately marked direction. You'll notice that some of them do have times depicted on them, and that means that those airways are one way during those times, which are Zulu or UTC times. Another symbol you might have seen on the high charts and wondered what it was is the green airplane symbol. This is just a holdover from paper charts. Each chart would have a half airplane symbol on it, and if you lined up the half airplanes to make whole airplanes, you could use that to line up the charts and make a bigger chart for navigating across two charts or for making a nice wall chart to hang in your FBO. That concludes this video. Hopefully it's giving you the knowledge you need to be able to use IFR en route charts and safely navigate en route under IFR. As always, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you've enjoyed the content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.